Thompson. I'm Dr. Merritt Trelstad, and I'm the University Chair of Lutheran Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. And again, it's my honor to welcome and introduce Dr. Deanna Thompson, who is both a friend and a treasured colleague. Dr. Thompson is the director of the Lutheran Center for Faith, Values, and Community, and the Martin E. Marty Regents Chair in Religion at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. Prior to St. Olaf College, she taught religion at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota for over 20 years. She's a graduate of St. Olaf and holds the PhD from Vanderbilt University. On a more personal note, though, Dr. Thompson and I talked about how we wanted to actually just explain a little bit. With the Lutheran Conference, the Lutheran Studies Conference, every year I get to shape or pick a topic. And in talking with the religion department and talking with Kendall and other people across the university, we wanted to offer some kind of balm, or at least conversation that speaks into kind of the time that we're living through right now. Last year we had Pastor Lenny Duncan, who came to talk about anti-racism and the ELCA church. And this year with COVID-19, I wanted to invite Dr. Thompson to come and speak, and wanted to read her books myself because they've actually been great help to a number of people who I personally know who have been working through faith and serious illness. And I value them because they hold a place for a lack of healing and a lack of resolution and an affirmation of faith. Her book is about having faith in experiences and times of being undone by serious illness. And I think that this is relevant to those with that experience and those who love them. And it seems to touch on almost every life in some way, particularly now in the stream of COVID-19. I found that book, as I mentioned, Hoping for More, one of her books, and this one, Glimpsing Resurrection, to speak gospel and balm into our time. And she holds open a space for lament and anger and lack of resolution and hope and love in ways that I hope you'll also find meaningful. So I am really grateful to have Dr. Thompson just take over and lead us on in the conversation this morning. Thank you so much, Deanna, for being here.
Thanks so much, Merritt, and thanks, Kendall. Great to be with you. Since we have a more intimate group, I'm wondering if we could start with introductions of people who are here, who would like to say who you are and maybe where you're coming from. That would be great for me. I taught on Zoom last year for the first time, and as we were hearing, when it's just boxes and you don't know exactly who's on the other side or why they're a part of the conversation, it makes it harder, I think. So would love to just hear if you wanted to introduce yourself, and maybe if you're connected to a congregation or which is what brought you here this morning, that would be awesome. And then I'll jump into saying a few things about the topic. So maybe FPC Zoom, do you want to start?
Hi, I'm Lee Duty, and I'm from Queen Anne Lutheran.
Great, thank you.
And I'm Susan Evans, and I'm from Queen Anne Lutheran.
Oh, great.
I'm Margaret Shaw. I'm from Queen Anne Lutheran, and my dad, Joe Shaw, taught religion at St. Olaf.
Yes, awesome. I see the from too on your name. Great. Others of you.
Hi, I finally unmuted my microphone. I'm Linda Minus. I'm from First Presbyterian Church in McMinnville, Oregon. And my husband is dealing with late stage dementia, and I'm dealing with that too. And I'm looking for a broad perspective on end of life things.
I'm sorry to hear that, and thanks for sharing that. Larissa, Renee, or Kayla?
I'm Renee. I am a retired ELCA pastor, a St. Olaf alum from. I moved to the state of Washington from Colorado just as everything was shutting down.
Mm-hmm.
And so my transition has been 18 months, and I still don't have a church home. I've been listening mostly online to Mount Olivet Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, because David Lose was a seminary professor when I was there, and I love him. So
yeah,
but it's not helping me get more aligned with what I need to be doing here. So hopefully, once more people are vaccinated and I get a booster, I'll be out and about more. But I have not read your book. I'm going to say that on the front end.
That's totally fine.
I was just curious. I thought if I heard the conversation, I would be motivated to do that. So I'm just going to have to listen. But I do appreciate all the things you're doing, Deanna, at St. Olaf. Blessed to have you.
Thank you.
I can't stay more than an hour. I don't know how long this is supposed to go, but be that as it may, that's kind of where I am. I'm dealing with my own issues of feeling more lonely and isolated than I had anticipated. It's just no fun.
Right.
And I've had a cancer spot removed on my head and one on my leg that aren't healing all that well. So, but I'm 72, so let's get real. I mean, life happens. So anyway, thanks for listening.
Thank you. We're introducing ourselves for those of you who've just joined us, where you're coming from, maybe why you've joined us this morning.
Hi, my name's Larissa. I am a student at Pacific Lutheran University.
Awesome.
And I am here because this conference is one of the conferences that I wanted to attend because I couldn't attend the other conferences.
Okay.
So, and yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Glad you're here. So Dan or Sarah or Kayla, would any of you like to introduce yourselves? Dan, it looks like you're not alone. Looks like you've got a group.
I'm Kayla, and I'm also a student at PLU, and the conference is, something we were talking about in class, and we were reading parts of the book in Dr. Trailstad's class, so I was just coming out of curiosity and to learn more.
Great. Awesome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am in the same boat as Miss Kayla and Larissa.
Wonderful.
But I'm also interested in, what everybody has to say as well. Because it's an assignment.
Awesome. Thanks. Looks like we might hear from Dan in the room. There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Hi. This is Dan Peterson, pastor of Queen Anne Lutheran Church. We have a forum gathered here to hear your observations. We're really looking forward to it. Hi, Merritt. I'm a former PLU faculty member, so it's always great.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so we're just glad to be here and looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. Well, it's really great. Thanks for introducing yourselves. And I have a much better sense, right, of who we are together. And that's really great. What I plan to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the book Glimpsing Resurrection came to be. And, some of you talking about the pandemic and isolation. My talk on Tuesday night is really going to link much more to thinking about how my own experience of really being quarantined by illness, really having to come to terms with a vocation that I didn't choose, that is living with incurable cancer, and how that relates to, I think, a number of dynamics in the pandemic in particular. But we can certainly talk about that as well after the presentation. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see that? Thinking, looks like
Yes.
it's there. Yes. Okay. So as you may know, in 2008, I broke my back, and it was unclear how my back got broken. I went through a lot of tests in the fall of 2008. I had to wear a full torso brace and take a lot of opioids because of the pain. And it didn't get better. Instead, it got worse, and a second vertebra broke in December of 2008 after I'd been wearing a torso brace and doing all the things that the medical professionals were telling me to do. And on December 10th in 2008, I got diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. So the cancer had spread from my breast to my back and was eating away at my vertebrae. And I was 42 years old, and I had a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. And as you can imagine, this was pretty devastating news. Most people who have what I have don't live very long with the disease. And so I'm a professor of religion. I'm a theologian, and I say that I'm a professional talker. Part of what professors do is profess. But right away after the diagnosis, words really went away, words to talk about my own condition and words to talk about how I saw God present in all of this. Those words went away. And one of the biggest tasks for me over the coming months was to really try to locate language, to try and talk about the experience that I was living through. And because I'm an academic, I'm a teacher, I'm a writer, a speaker, the writing that I started to do to try to make sense of my diagnosis and make sense of what faith looked like in light of the diagnosis became the first book that I wrote about cancer, called Hoping for More: Having Cancer, Talking Faith, and Accepting Grace. One of the chapters in this book focused on what I have been calling the virtual body of Christ. So in 2008, I didn't own a cell phone and was very self-righteous about that fact. I believed that the digital technology really wasn't helping us be more connected to one another. My kids didn't own cell phones. I was very proud of that fact as well. But when I got stage 4 cancer, my world became very small, and my brother immediately started to use digital tools like a Caring Bridge website to tell people about what was happening to me. And I really was overwhelmed by the kind of support that came to me via a website. And I was really also, one of the big surprises for me was that when people would see me in person with a broken back, I couldn't get out of a chair by myself. I couldn't get dressed by myself. I couldn't drive. I couldn't. And the treatment I went into was really intense and made me very, very sick, even sicker than I had been. I lost a lot of weight. You could see my ribs coming through my clothes. And when I would see people in person, the kind of typical interaction was me just starting to, cry and get very emotional and really not be able to speak and say very much about what was going on with me. And I started to realize that, actually the place I felt like I could most express the sadness and the things that were happening to me of living with this really serious illness was I could express them online. I could express them virtually, and I could write in full sentences, and the tears that I was that were flowing from my eyes didn't interrupt my ability to kind of share how I was doing. And that focus in this first book ended up becoming a second book, which is called The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World. And this really starts with what I call my conversion experience to the potential positive power of digital technology to help us better be the body of Christ, to better care for one another at the worst times in our lives. It's not that, if you know someone who's sick, just send a text and everything will be okay. But it's trying to think about how we can use digital tools to better care for one another during the worst times of our lives. As you might imagine, this book came out in 2016, but since the pandemic, this topic has really come to the fore again, as churches all have gone virtual, using digital tools in ways that we never maybe would have imagined. And then about 6 years ago, I got invited by a friend of mine, Shelley Rambo, who's at Boston University, to be a part of a project that eventually became this book, which is called Post-Traumatic Public Theology. And my friend Shelley Rambo at Boston University is a theologian who focuses work on trauma. And she invited me to write a chapter on trauma and serious illness. And I will say, before I got invited by Shelley to participate in this project, I didn't know anything about trauma and serious illness. I knew about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and how it affects people who've been in the military and how people who've survived sexual assault, etc. But I didn't know anything about trauma and its relationship to serious illness. But based on her request, I started to do some research and realize that there's actually a ton of research out there on people who live with serious chronic illness, in particular cancer, and how they experience traumatic effects from living with serious chronic illness. And this really rocked my world. I will say that reading this material was not just an academic experience. It was an incredibly personal and helpful experience. I would read this stuff about how trauma works in people with serious illness, and I would say, oh my gosh, like this is explaining my life in a way that nothing up until this point has explained my life. I found it so incredibly insightful and helpful. And then at the same time, I was also fairly disturbed that I had already been a cancer patient for 6 years, and no one in the cancer world in the medical world had said anything about this. Most of what I was reading about in terms of trauma and serious illness came from nursing journals, medical studies. And so I was really kind of troubled that no one had ever talked to me about the trauma piece. So that led to what is the book that we're kind of looking at today, which is called Glimpsing Resurrection, Cancer, Trauma, and Ministry. And this book focuses on using trauma literature, the studies that have been done of people who live with chronic serious illness. And it tries to talk about how trauma works in people's lives, especially in people's lives who live with really serious health conditions. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief overview of what the book talks about. Some of you may have looked at the chapters that Merritt recommended, but I'm going to give you a sense of what I'm doing in this book, and then I would just love for you to bring up your thoughts, questions, comments based on what you hear. So first of all, I begin the book with thinking about stories by people who live with cancer. So I use Arthur Frank, who is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's a sociologist, and before he turned 40, he had a heart attack in his late 30s, and he got cancer. And one of the things he does is he's now become a sociologist of illness. And he writes a lot about the differences, for example, of his experience of getting a heart attack versus getting ill with cancer, where no one talked to him in terms of a heart attack about fighting the heart attack and just the way in which we tend to talk about cancer in our society. So as a sociologist of illness, he spends a lot of time thinking about our language and how we kind of come together around people who are ill. Paul Kalanithi, many of you may have read his beautiful and heartbreaking book, When Breath Becomes Air. He was a Stanford neurosurgeon who got stage 4 cancer and writes about, in the few years he lived before he died of the cancer, he writes about the experience of being a physician, but also a patient, and how to deal with being told that you have terminal cancer. Susan Gubar has written for the New York Times. She has stage 4 ovarian cancer, and usually you don't live very long with that diagnosis. And she's written very powerfully in the Times, but also in books about her life, the kind of inside of the life with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Carrie Host also wrote very powerfully about her experience with stage 4 cancer before she died, when her kids were quite young. Audre Lorde wrote about having breast cancer in the 1970s. She wrote what are called cancer journals that are published, and before, when ways of treating cancer and ways of treating women with breast cancer was very different than it is now, but a lot of her emotional experiences and psychological experiences of living with one breast. She talks about, how do I face the world one-breasted? So thinking about her experiences of that. Barbara Ehrenreich, some of you may be familiar with her. She's a pretty biting social critic. She's written a book called Nickel and Dimed. She does a lot of undercover kinds of investigations of our American culture. She got breast cancer and has written, again, quite bitingly about the way in which there's a pressure to tell positive stories of living with cancer, and how she really rebels against that. Many of you may be familiar with Kate Bowler. She is a Duke University professor who got stage 4 colon cancer in her early 30s when her son was just 2 years old. And she wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. And she has a podcast that's incredibly popular these days called Everything Happens. And I draw on some of her experiences of living with cancer. Todd Billings also got stage 4 cancer in his 30s. He's a seminary professor in Michigan who's written powerfully about his experiences. Christian Wyman, stage 4 cancer in his 30s, is a professor at Yale Divinity School and a poet, writes a lot about his experiences. Jason Micheli, stage 4 cancer in his 30s, a pastor on the East Coast, writing about living with cancer. And finally, a friend, Camille Scheel, who has the same kind of cancer I have and passed away about 4 years ago and lived just up the road from me, who's also written about life with cancer. So I take the stories of all of these people, the insights of all of these people, and put it together with the recent research on trauma and serious illness. So in the first chapter of the book, I talk about being undone by cancer. I think that most everyone understands that getting diagnosed with cancer is really hard there's a really challenging physical reality of that. But I think what is less well known is how the undoing of the body is also an undoing of your sense of self. Like Audre Lorde's question, what does it mean to be one-breasted in the world? How do I live that way? Susan Gubar, who has ovarian cancer, says, what does it mean to be a person who has to have a bathroom in view at all times and who can't really think about much else beyond stool softeners? What does that mean to be a human being when these are so defining in terms of our experiences? The second thing that I look at is the point that Barbara Ehrenreich brings up, the pressure to tell the positive cancer story, that he fought so bravely. She was always so positive. And especially Barbara Ehrenreich really has very little time for the positive story. And that's not to say you shouldn't ever be hopeful or positive or optimistic, but just when there's a kind of pressure to tell that positive story, especially when your own life or the life of someone you know is not following a positive trajectory. One of the things that is very prominent in the trauma literature is one of the things that trauma does is it robs you of your ability to imagine a future. And so I look at these different cancer stories and how people have a really hard time imagining, especially when they're done with treatment. If treatment is successful and the world kind of opens up again, it's really hard for a lot of people to imagine how to live in this new reality, especially when they have maybe a chronic condition like stage 4 cancer, which is incurable. And then the last one is really the threat to meaning making. There's a lot of pressure also that people should be learning something from their cancer, that it should be edifying to them, that they should be, minding every moment in a way that you don't when you're not really ill. And those things can happen, but there can also be an incredible disorientation and a sense of lack of meaning. Christian Wyman, who's at Yale Divinity School, writes in one of his books, after 7 years of living with incurable cancer and experiencing like suffering I never could have imagined, he said, I'm not sure I'm any more clear on whether suffering means anything at all. I'm just not sure it does. So, I mean, this is the kind of narrative, kind of storyline that I want to try to explore. So when we think of trauma and its relationship to illness, I really appreciate my friend Shelley's definition of trauma. So she, in her writings, says that trauma is the suffering that remains. So there's an event that happens, a life-altering event in many cases. The person who experiences that or the community that experiences that continues to live on. And in many cases, that trauma, the experience of trauma, that initial experience is over, but the suffering continues on with you. So people who live with the traumatic after effects of being in the military, fighting in a war, the war can be over or their service can be done, and they can experience over and over again through night terrors, through reactions to certain sounds. The suffering is still with them in a very powerful and real way. One of the things that's different about trauma and cancer, or trauma and a lot of serious illness, is that in a lot of discussion about trauma, one of the main things that you try to do in terms of addressing the trauma is you try to rearrange the relationship you have with the threat. So if it's particular noises, so if you were part of a war situation and certain noises just completely freak you out, one of the things that much therapy will try to do is try to help rewire your brain to have a different reaction to those external stressors. One of the realities about cancer is that it's an internal threat. And that makes it harder in many cases to renegotiate your relationship to the threat because it's a part of you. It's literally your body. So there's some discussion about whether or not people who live with chronic serious illness can ever be post-trauma, but rather will continue to live with that effect. And a really, really important piece that probably is very evident to most of you is that trauma does not just affect the one who lives with the serious illness, but it really extends to family members, to caregivers, to close friends, to people who are who are seeing the experience on the inside. So one of the chapters that Merritt recommended that people maybe look at for this forum is that I have a chapter where I look at places in the biblical story that may be helpful for people who are trying to deal with the trauma of living with a serious illness. And I look at 4 different places. There are certainly more that could have been looked at. But one of the things that I have found after almost 13 years of living with incurable cancer, and I'm in my 4th remission right now. So I just had a reoccurrence last fall after 8 years of being in my 3rd remission. And this is how the best case scenario for my condition is, that I will continue to go in and out of remission, but we will continue to be able to treat it. One of the things I have realized is that many people in a faith context, in a Christian context, often feel a lot of pressure to have something really awful, like stage 4 cancer, or the sudden death of someone near to them, or we can think of all these different awful things that happen. There's pressure to have it make sense, to have it put into a story where it gets tied up at the end, or there's a reason for why it happened, or I'm a better person than before I had this happen to me, these kinds of things. And one of the things that I think that I want to try to contribute to this conversation is that I think that there's a lot of space in the Christian story for people to be undone, and that there isn't a necessary move to immediately resolving it or immediately having it all make sense, even though I feel like many of us in Christian communities feel very strongly that pressure. So the first place I look at the Lament Psalms. So in the Old Testament, there's the book of Psalms, 150 Psalms total, 60 of them, so almost half of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are lament Psalms. This means they are cries of grief, they're cries of anger, they're cries of people who are undone by all sorts of things, undone by injustice, undone by oppression, undone by illness, undone by the sudden loss of someone dear to them. So when we think about Psalm 22, this is the psalm that Jesus uses or recites from the cross in 2 of the Gospels. So Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I tell my students that a more contemporary translation would be, my God, where the hell are you? I cry out and you are silent. That is a lament psalm. It's right next to Psalm 23, which is, of course, the psalm that many of us rely on when really bad things happen. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down by green pastures. He restores my soul. That was very powerful for me shortly after my diagnosis. At the same time, many of the lament psalms contain anger at God. My God, where are you? I cry out and you are silent. Psalm 88 is perhaps the most desolate lament psalm. It ends in despair. It ends with saying, darkness is my only friend, as it says on the screen here. I'm glad that not all lament psalms end in despair. Most of them end with God hears my cry, some kind of movement toward healing. But Psalm 88 doesn't. It ends in despair. And I actually think it's really good that there's at least one psalm that ends in despair. Because what it tells me is that despair can coexist with faith. That anger against God can coexist with faith. And I feel like when I've talked to people over the past decade plus who live with really awful things in their lives, and they're people of faith. Many of them feel worse and feel like they're not faithful if they're mad at God, or they experience God's absence, or they feel despair. And one of the things I think we as communities of faith should be saying is that's actually, and it's in the Bible. It's an experience within faith rather than an experience outside of faith. Many of you are likely very familiar with the story of Job and how that deals with the problem of suffering. I look at the story of Job through the lens that Job also was seriously ill. And one of the things I also focus on is the way in which Job and his spouse are on very different pages. She says early on, first or second chapter, Job, you should curse God and die. And Job initially says, like, this isn't on God. Like, I'm not going to curse God. And then a chapter later, Job says, I curse the day I was born. And one of the things I think, looking at the Job story and the marriage relationship between Job and his wife, I think is really revealing of how difficult living with a really serious chronic illness can be on a relationship like a marriage. It's really taxing, and often you're on different pages. And the Job story, there's much more that we could talk about than we have time for here, but there's a lot of lack of resolution in the Job story. And I think that actually honors the messiness of a lot of our experiences of suffering. The third illustration that I used in the chapter is looking at the crucifixion story, particularly as it's told in the Gospel of Mark. Some of you may know that originally the Gospel of Mark ended where the women come to the tomb and find it's empty, and they flee in terror and tell no one. Scholars have argued and shown how the final ending that's in Mark today is a later ending that was added later, where the resurrection appearances happen. In other words, there's much more resolution at the end of Mark than there initially was. So scholars that are interested in looking at trauma and the biblical text have said, what if we were to linger at that first ending of Mark, where the women see the empty tomb and flee and tell no one? Not that we stop the story there permanently, but what if we are not so quick to move to Easter and we try to imagine what that terror must have felt like, how unnerved and disoriented these women were, and live in that space for a little while longer than we typically do. How might that help make space for people who feel like they live in that space themselves? The final example that I use is talking about what Christians tend to call Holy Saturday. And this is the space in between the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is Lutherans. A lot of Lutheran churches will have a service on Holy Saturday, will acknowledge this space. The dominant kind of forms of Christianity tend to move pretty quickly toward Easter. They acknowledge the crucifixion. This is horrible. Linger on that a little bit, and then move immediately to resolution, to new life, to resurrection. The Christian story really has this pause of Holy Saturday, of the space of disorientation. The Creed, the Apostles' Creed, talks about Christ descending to hell or descending to the dead. And this is a space where people who look at trauma, Holy Saturday has become a space that they want to investigate. If we make more space for people to understand Holy Saturday, that Jesus, that God has been in the spaces that are so awful that there really aren't words to put to how awful they are. God has been there too. So I then think about the church and the church as a space for lament, as not only a space for lament, but I'm not sure if we practice lament as often as we could, or maybe that we should. So this practice of lament in a communal way, I think, helps us practice how to be with each other when we're undone by the suffering that we experience in the world. For me, when I had no words after getting diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, the words of the Psalms actually were really, really helpful to me. They helped give me words when I didn't have any of my own. And I wonder if practicing more lament can help us develop more of a vocabulary of how to meet people in those undone spaces. I also think that we want to think more about how we can use our digital tools to meet people in our congregations who are undone. One of the things, I'm a daughter of a pastor. 2 of my uncles are pastors. My grandfather was a pastor. I'm a kind of go to church every Sunday kind of Christian. And when I got stage 4 cancer, I found it incredibly hard to go to church. And that was really surprising to me. I was so undone. I felt so vulnerable that it was really many days too hard to physically go and be in that space and be so undone in a public space. And I really do think that our digital ways of connecting with each other can really be helpful for connecting with people when just being in public and being so undone is so hard. Finally, and this is the last slide, and then we're going to open it up for comments, questions. The last chapter, I really try to look at the concept of hope and how we as Christians talk about hope, not just for today or tomorrow, the hope in this world, but also try to say some things about hope for life beyond this one. And I use this passage from 1 Thessalonians 4. This is a passage that many Christians who believe in the rapture tend to use. And one of the things I started to realize as I continue to sit in the chemo room, I sit in the chemo room, I have for all 12 years of living with this, at first much more often than I do now. And one of the things as a theologian sitting there in the chemo room with all these precious people who are potentially facing the end of their lives, I thought, I feel like I'm part of a branch of Christianity that really doesn't have much to say about life beyond this one. And there's good reasons for that. We've said in the history of Christianity, there's been far too much focus on the next world, and we've ignored the importance of this world. Well, life sucks now for you. Well, you'll be with God eternally, so it doesn't really matter how bad things are for you right now. But as I continued to sit in the chemo room, I thought, we Lutherans, we Christians who are maybe on the more progressive side of things, need to say more than nothing about life beyond this one. Because there's a lot in the Christian story, there's a lot in the biblical text that points toward a life with God beyond this one. And so in the chapter, I look at this return of Christ. I look at people being raised from the dead. And I think that a lot of this language is not necessarily to be taken literally. And I think that's part of more progressive Christianity's challenge too. Say, well, we scientifically know what happens to the body when it dies. And so we have trouble with a lot of this imagery. Much of this imagery, many biblical scholars will say, is meant to be metaphorical, meant to be imagistic. It's describing something that none of us really knows what's ahead. But one of the things I try to focus on is the promises that are made, and that there are promises in the biblical text that God makes, that there is life beyond this one. in Romans 8, talking about nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, neither life nor death. And I think those are words that can be really helpful to people. So Paul ends this section that I examine with, encourage one another with these words. And I try to think about the need that we have in Christianity to talk about, especially for people who are seriously ill and who are not going to get better, that there's hope not just for more life in this life, more living in the here and now, but there's hope for life beyond, even as we don't know and fully understand what that looks like.